Thank you. So our next speaker is Angelo Villagomez, working currently at the Pew Bartarelli, is that right?
Close enough.
Okay, Ocean Legacy for the Pew Charitable Trust. And he'll be presenting his talk today on the science, make sure I'm on the right title here, the science of wayfinding. Can ancient knowledge and values inform modern conservation decisions? Thank you.
Applause. Thank you. It'll probably be the last time that you applaud while I'm up here. The second to last time that you applaud. Oh my goodness, it's just going to keep on going. So before I get started, I just want to again thank Simon and Sylvia for putting together this great workshop, this conference. It's just been a fantastic day. It's going to be very difficult to live up to Mario's presentation yesterday, but I'm going to do my best to bring the same level of excitement. So the title of my presentation is actually a little bit misleading because I don't really consider myself a wayfinder or a scientist. I've spent my professional career using science, but to affect public policy, to protect our ocean, because we want more fish, right? It's very important to all of us. I have put my Twitter and my Instagram up there for those if there are any college students who actually tweet. I'm not on Snapchat, so don't use that. But if you feel the need to tweet, my handle is @TauTauTasi. In the last presentation, we learned that Tasi means ocean, Tau means people, so my handle is People of the Ocean. And I'm going to talk about values, and this hasn't really come up in this conversation yet, and there are a lot of parallels with values that Westerners have and Pacific Islanders have, but oftentimes Pacific Islanders will have a little different way of looking at the world. And I learned of a great way of looking at the future during some work that I did in Hawaii recently. And if you ask a Westerner, if you're looking at the future and you're making plans, what do? You face the future and you charge into the future. And the past is something that's behind you, and it's something that you leave behind. But in many Pacific cultures, and actually also in some South American cultures, they believe that the future is behind you. Has anybody heard this before? Okay, lots of nods, but I'd like to share this story because it really opens your eyes to a different way of looking at the world. The future is behind you, and that sounds crazy, because that means that the past is in front of you. But if you think about it, it kind of is. The past is something that we can see. There are lessons, and we can look to the past. And we have no idea what's going to happen in the future, so we actually are walking backwards. But we're using those things that we learned to make sure that we don't fall over the cliff. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a quick agenda. I'm going to talk about knowledge and values, jump into wayfinding in nature, talk about fishing, because that's one of the most important things in Pacific Islands, and then jump into, looking forward. We can't look forward because it's behind us, but just going to try to tie the talk all together at the very end. Now, this audience, I don't actually need to talk about the fact that indigenous and traditional knowledge exists in this room, because we've already spent an entire day talking about it and you were all convinced. But I was at a science conference earlier this summer, and there was a whole workshop on traditional knowledge, and in a very Derek Zoolander moment, at the end of the conference, a woman raised her hand and said, "What do you mean by traditional knowledge?" And for some folks in the West, there's this idea that it doesn't really become knowledge until a white guy knows it, or that it's, they don't really have knowledge, and these noble savages are just kind of like walking around in their grass skirts, having a good time, they don't really know anything. But I postulate that there is strong knowledge that was possibly even gathered using the scientific method. And this is my favorite example, and I hope all of you steal this from me and share it. Has anybody heard of HMS Terror or the HMS Erebus? Great, some folks. So these are British ships that were trying to find a passage through Canada to get from Europe to Asia through the Northwest Passage. And in about, I've got it written down here, in 1848, the Erebus and the Terror disappeared. Somewhere in Canada, they just disappeared. And for 160 years, explorers have tried to find them. They go up to Canada, and some wouldn't even come back, they die. And it's one of the great mysteries of the modern world. What the heck happened to the Erebus and the Terror? But if they had thought to actually ask an Inuit person, one of the indigenous people, and they eventually did, and the conversation kind of went like this. They said, hey, we're looking for this ship. It sank about 160 years ago. Do you have any idea where it might be? No, maybe it's next to the island of Kiwiwu. Well, what does that mean? Sunken ship. So, there's these stories and this knowledge and these ideas that are within indigenous cultures that get shared through the oral tradition, but they don't make their way onto print. So they're not valued as much as Western knowledge, but they're also very important. Now, I also postulate that we get our values from our knowledge. And you've probably seen this on Facebook. People, tree huggers like me, love taking this, putting it on a nice picture, and posting it to Facebook, and then all your friends like it and leave similar comments. But you could actually say this backwards. So this says conservation and love, that is the value, comes from our understanding. But I would also say that understanding leads to love and to values. So I'm tying knowledge and values together. So we're here to talk about voyaging, and to fully understand voyaging, we have to consider how it developed. So whether you believe voyaging developed under the influence of supernatural influences or trial and error over thousands of years, I hope that we can at least agree that the world that when the first voyagers were crossing the Pacific, that world is very different from the world that we know today. It was a world that had much more life in it. There was more fish. The animals were bigger. They were more abundant. Whales, sharks, turtles, and these are numbers that we can't even imagine. There's this idea called shifting baselines, where when you're a kid, you see the ocean and you come to think that is normal. And when your parents, your grandparents talk about what the ocean was like, you're like, nah, grandpa's crazy. There weren't that many fish back then. But it's true. This is the kind of thing that somebody coming up to Hawaii for the first time would have seen. And you don't see this on Waikiki Beach anymore. You have to go to Midway, places in the middle of nowhere. And there's a Western slant to this, and this is Jane Dovchenko. She's one of the great ocean scientists, and she says, for most of its history, the ocean was a de facto fully protected area, simply because humans could not access it. And if you think about traditional technologies for fishing, bow and hooks, coconut twine lines, versus what we're able to do today. And that's not even considering, that's just fishing. There's also climate change, and there's plastic pollution, there's carbon pollution. So our world has changed so much. At the same time, our culture depends on this ancient world. We've developed these unique cultures across the Pacific with our own languages, way of life, dances, song, chants, art, carvings, tattoos, even jewelry, stories, religion, architecture, economies, governing systems. This is right next. This is Yap. So these guys are like, hey, I know where that is. We live. That's me. It's a fish. So we're gonna talk about fishing. But when we got to this world, we needed to feed ourselves, and the way we did this was by fishing. We can't talk about Pacific cultures without talking about fish. And there's a great book about Palau where there's this chief who says, "Culture is fish." And it's been written that there are two things that have brought the Pacific together in the last 50 years. The first one is the ocean, and in particular, stewardship of the ocean. And if you think of the fight against nuclear proliferation, that was led by Pacific Islands. If you think about the fight against climate change, we just lost Tony DeBrum earlier this year, but when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, it was the small island developing states that were leading the charge. And now there's a lot more attention being paid to the ocean, and just recently there was a conference at the United Nations to discuss Sustainable Development Goal number 14, which is protect the ocean, and it was the Pacific Islands again leading the way. That second icon of the Pacific, of course, is voyaging, which is what we're here all to talk about. I am not the person to ask about voyaging. There are plenty of other folks in the room who do a much better job. But I would like to point out that we haven't really discussed the symbolism of the canoe yet. We've talked about the math, we've talked about engineering, we've talked about how to sail them. But there's actually, my identity is attached to this thing. To compare it to how Americans feel, it's like taking a Corvette, an American flag, putting an American eagle in it. So there's so much wrapped up into these canoes. It's not just about transport. It actually defines who we are. And there's knowledge attached to it, and of course there's values attached to it. And so I'm going to kind of switch gears now and talk about some of the knowledge of voyaging that I've learned about and how that ties into modern concepts of conservation and how the values that came out of this can actually inform some decisions of how we take care of our ocean. So, again, not the person to be talking about wayfinding, but Pacific Islanders used observations of the natural environment, and that's actually very similar to what modern scientists do. The scientific method, the first thing you do is you make observations, then you make a hypothesis, then you test that hypothesis. If it's wrong, you make another one, and if it's right, you retest it, and after 4,000 years, you're able to sail a canoe across the ocean. We've talked about the stars, we've talked about the wind, and we've touched a little bit on some of the biological indicators. They could be biocultural resources, but the voyagers would use birds and fish and whales and other sea life to help them find help them find islands. Birds in particular were very important. And there are three bird species that were particularly important. And what they do is, if you're in one of these voyaging canoes, you're pretty low to the ocean. And a lot of these islands, Saipan is pretty tall, Guam is pretty tall, but Satawal is maybe 6 feet above sea level. And if you're not within 3 to 4 to 5 miles of Satawal, you're going to sail right by that. But birds nest on these islands, and depending on the species of bird, the time of day, and most importantly, the direction the bird is flying. You want to make sure you follow the bird that's going towards the island. It can expand the area, the target area, from 10 miles to 40 or 50 miles, and this is a safety issue for voyagers. It's not just about finding the island; it's about getting them safely to their target. I have to apologize. I'm actually going to use images that I stole from the movie Moana to highlight the birds. That's what these canoes are from. Because there's a great scene in the movie where they're singing where there's a bird in the scene, and there's also dolphins and stars and winds. It's a great scene. But here we are. Here's our canoe. Our navigator is actually the second guy from the front. He doesn't see the bird yet. He's just looking towards the horizon. But he does see the bird, and he looks up at it, and he's judging the time of day, and he's wondering, is it the right species? If it's an albatross, and I follow it, I might be going towards Alaska. But if this is a fairy tern, or I think a gray noddy or something, a brown noddy or a blue noddy, it's the right bird. And of course, what happens in the movie is they follow the bird and they find, what's the island's name? Something Nui? I forget. It doesn't matter. But they find the island, and they build their village, and then they sing a bunch of songs, and it's a fantastic movie. And the guys don't like to mention this, but they cried at the end. It's a really great movie. So, how did they learn this? Was this handed down for supernatural purposes? Maybe. There are some folks who believe that. Or was it done using the scientific method? Now, let's switch gears. These are some scientists from Virginia, believe it or not, who have really never heard of voyaging. This is before the movie Moana came out. And what they did is that this is Hawaii. You can see the big island down in the corner. They went to French frigate shoals, and they stuck GPS on these birds. And the birds would that would fly, and what they found is that you can actually pretty well measure how far away a bird will fly from an island when it's nesting to come back and feed its chicks. And they postulate that the reason they're doing this is because of interspecies competition. The birds that are really good at fishing are catching the first fish, and the birds that aren't as good kind of have to fly a little bit further. So they noticed this, and it lines up perfectly with what the voyagers have known for 4,000 years. And the reason this happens is, as I was just describing, what's going on is there's little fish that are swimming near the surface, and there's swordfish and sharks and tuna that are forcing them towards the surface, getting them into really tight schools, and the birds are aware of this. They can smell the fish, and they're dive bombing the fish from the top. And fishermen will look for these birds, and if you talk to fishermen, this is also a type of traditional knowledge, they can tell you based on what they're seeing on the surface and the type of birds that are going after the fish, they can actually tell you if it's yellowfin or skipjack or rainbow runners or whatnot. But the values that we get out of this is we know that in order to find those islands, we need birds, and in order to have birds go after these bait balls, we need big fish below. So the value that comes out of this is that these animals are important for our way of life. In order to get back and forth to these different islands, we actually need sharks. Who would have thought? Crazy ideas. So this is a typical island scene. You know what island this is? Nope. 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 It's Marianas. This is actually my dad. He's about my age, and he is fishing on Pagan. The year before I was born, he actually got stranded up there, similar to what you guys did. And he had just happened to have his talazza with him, and he caught enough fish to feed the village in a couple of hours. But this is actually a modern type of fishing, believe it or not. This from that, you could go to Florida and you see a Puerto Rican guy fishing in Daytona Beach with a net like this. This technology is used throughout Southeast Asia, but we consider this a traditional fishing method. But it's not the ancient fishing method, but it is a cultural fishing method. Another type of fishing, this is really common. A couple of dudes in a boat, maybe had a 6-pack of beer. They've got a couple of lines, they've got an outboard motor, and they're probably going to catch like maybe 2 mahi, a wahoo, and 3 tuna, and then they're going to head back in and probably call it a day. So limited amounts of fishing, but even this limited amount of fishing does have an effect on the ecosystem. And these are modern technologies. Even with the ancient technologies, they had an effect on the ecosystem, and the ancients recognized this. And they found that there were, sometimes the resource would be reduced. And of course, this matches up with modern science. That fish that I caught, that was actually from Kirmas, the population 5,000 people, best fishing in the world. The airport's only open on Wednesdays, so you get there on a Wednesday, you have to stay a week, and then the next following Wednesday you get to leave. And by then, when I went, they ran out of beer on the second day. So they ran out of wholesale beer, but there were still pockets of beer like at people's houses. So every night at around like 5 or 6 o'clock, we would try to find the remaining beer on the island. And then by the time Wednesday came around and I was flying back to Fiji, I was looking forward to my first Fiji gold. But I digress. Even small amounts of fishing can have an effect on an ecosystem. So this is some work that's been done on the Hawaiian Islands, and they looked at Kirmas, which is a tiny population of 5,000 people. Now, the only thing available to these guys is fishing. There's no McDonald's. All of their food is coming from the ocean, so there's actually a lot of fishing, and there's a very high percentage of fishermen. So a place like Tinian or Rota on the Marianas would have fewer fishermen, whereas everybody's eating fish. Versus Kingman Atoll, which is just to the north, with a population of 0, and considerable differences in the ecosystem. The fish assemblage is completely different. There's no big snappers, there's no big sharks in this area that has relatively small amounts of fishing. But just to switch back to the ancients, So the idea, the way to combat that overfishing in the olden days was with taboo. It's an English word, most people know what taboo means. So basically the chief would say, you, don't fish there anymore. And there's lots of different ways that this is practiced. Sometimes it's in other places it's tambu, which is a similar word. And I was actually just talking with Mimi this morning about a tambu area that she visited that, based on the size of the giant clam, she estimated had been in place for 500 years. So I mean, so this is an idea that's existed for a very long time. And it's all across the Pacific. I hope you all know your geography, but from like Easter Island to New Zealand, they tend to call it a rahui. It can be taboo, tambu in Melanesia. In Palau, they say boom. In the Marshalls, they call it mo. I was just chatting with Larry. He kind of mispronounced this, but meshum in Yap, and I've heard I think in Satwa, is it called seal? I don't think Tony's here. But this concept of creating protected areas is accepted and is important to all Pacific people. And as a scientist who's been trained as a Western scientist, I was like, oh my gosh, there's parallels with modern conservation. And this is from a study that was done in 2009 that looked at 128 marine protected areas around the world. Found that when you create a protected area, you tend to get more fish, bigger fish, more fish biomass, and higher biodiversity. And one of the best benefits from these marine protected areas are called BOFs, big old fat fertile females. And these big old fat fertile females lay a whole bunch of eggs, exponentially higher eggs, and those eggs have healthier yolk sacs, and they have longer gestation periods, and they spawn more often. So when you have these big fish, you end up with exponentially more baby fish than if all you have is their skinny, younger counterparts. So, to the modern world. I showed you some traditional cultural fishing. This is what we're dealing with in the modern day. These are two types of fishing vessels. The big one is called a refueler, and that's the boat that brings the fish from the port to Asia, where it's canned. And then the one on the right is actually the boat that does the fishing. You see the yellow and black stuff on the back of it? That's the net. It's one net. And this net is about a mile wide. Just from different angles, so we're looking at, it's a pretty big boat. The purse seines are usually between 200 to 300 feet. The refuelers are anywhere between like 200, 300, 500 feet. Can anybody see what that yellow thing on the top of the purse seine is? It's a helicopter. I mean, this is large scale fishing. Can you imagine fishing with a helicopter? And what these boats are doing, these purse seines, is the helicopter will go up, it will look for an entire school of fish, and then the purse seine will come along and catch the entire school of fish. The purse seiner fills up its boat, fills up its hold, it comes back to port, where it will take 2 days to take these frozen fish and move them from the purse seine into the refueler. So giant amounts of fish. Now, if you eat canned tuna, this is where you probably were getting it from. I remember when I was a kid, probably about 10 years old, my dad saying, holding up a can of Mitsubishi tuna, and saying, so what we do is we allow them to fish in our waters, they take it back to Japan and can it, and bring it down here and sell us our own fish.
Yeah.
Another very popular type of fishing in the Pacific, these are called longliners. I should just say numbers. There's about 300 purse seines in the Pacific, and they catch a whole lot of skipjack. There are thousands of these purse seiners, and these are like the rogues of the Pacific. Whenever you hear of illegal fishing, it's this technology. And these boats are catching sushi. They're looking for big eye tuna. That's me again. Big fish. Each one of those fish is probably worth about $1,000. So that's about the price of an iPhone 8. It's a really high value fish. The other great fact I know about these fish is just like an iPhone, every single one gets a barcode. But it's so valuable. The fish comes off the boat, put it on the ground, they slap a barcode on it, and then they track it from port all the way to the restaurant. These are big eye. Bluefin is a cold tuna, so So it's like, that's either way up by Japan or down by Antarctica. These are tropical tunas. So this is actually in Madjo and Marshall Islands. The problem with long lines, and that they get their name because they have a long line that can be 30 to 50 miles long with 6,000 or 7,000 or 10,000 hooks, is they catch anything that wants to eat a piece of fish. So that's sharks and tuna. They even entangle humpback whales because the whales swim into it and they get all tangled up into it. A couple whales every year are caught this way. And as a result, the ocean is in trouble. There's a whole heck of a lot of fishing going on out there that wasn't going on 50 years ago. I should put one in here, but if you look at the graph of fishing over the last 50 years, it's just skyrocketed. 9% of global fish stocks are either depleted or fully fished. 9% of large fish are gone, that's why you don't catch big fish anymore. Seabirds have declined about 7% since 1950. And 100 million sharks are killed every year. And just to point out, one way those sharks are, the data says that for about every 2 tunas, 1 shark is caught. Those sharks they can be dumped overboard, but increasingly they're being eaten for meat, not just shark fin soup. And the trouble with sharks is they're like whales. They reproduce very slowly, they grow very slowly, and they actually don't spawn like tuna, they mate. So they only have a couple of sharks every other year. Oops, sorry. So, I'm getting towards that. I've actually gone over, I apologize. Just to kind of bring it all home, if we're going to have this renaissance of culture that we're talking about, we can't have it if our ocean has no fish in it. So, in order to actually have reach our full potential, we have to have an equal and parallel renaissance of environmental protection. And there will be, of course, there will be modern solutions. Again, this is Yap. We need modern types of enforcement, but we can call on some of those ancient values. And one of those is the taboo area. And there are about a dozen countries that are creating these protected areas that are gigantic in size. Palau is obviously the leader. They've actually set about 80% of their waters aside as a protected area. Marianas is about 5%. Niue, which is a territory of New Zealand down here, in the last month, they've declared that they're going to protect 40% of their EEZ. Easter Island, all the way on the right, is doing about 99% of their EEZ is going to be protected. Again, I'm going to go really fast. Just this is supported by science. The larger protected areas, the better it is. There will be more fish. How much do we protect? There's varying recommendations, but 30% seems to be the amount that people are suggesting. And then this is the slide, just in case you fell asleep during earlier parts of my presentation. My take-home messages are that traditional knowledge is real. Knowledge equal values. Our environment is based on our culture, and our culture comes from our environment. And if we're going to have this renaissance of culture, we also need to have a renaissance of environment. If you want to read some scientific papers, there they are. We don't really have time, but here are some discussion questions that I thought I would share with everybody. So thank you very much.